The prison that could not break Mandela. A little more than 11 kilometres from Cape Town lies a low, windswept island surrounded by the cold and dangerous waters of the Atlantic Ocean. For centuries, Robben Island had been used to isolate people whom those in power wanted society to forget: indigenous leaders, political opponents, prisoners, the sick and the unwanted. But during the Apartheid era, the island became something more sinister. It became a place where South Africa's white minority government attempted to bury an entire movement for human equality. Its most famous prisoner was Nelson Mandela. When Mandela arrived there in June 1964, he was 45 years old, convicted of sabotage and sentenced to imprisonment for the rest of his life. The government expected the Atlantic Ocean, the prison walls and the passing years to remove him from history. Instead, Robben Island helped transform him into one of the most recognizable political figures in the world. Mandela's imprisonment did not begin with the Rivonia trial. In 1962, he had already been arrested after secretly leaving South Africa without a passport and encouraging workers to participate in a strike. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. By then, apartheid had reduced South Africa's black majority to subjects in their own country, where people could live, work, travel, study or own property was determined largely by race. Political organizations opposing the system were banned, demonstrations were suppressed, and leading activists were arrested or driven underground. Mandela had initially supported non-violent resistance through the African National Congress. But after peaceful opposition was repeatedly met with state violence, particularly after the Sharpeville massacre of 1960, he helped establish Umkhonto we Sizwe, usually known as MK, the armed wing associated with the ANC. Its initial strategy concentrated on sabotage against government buildings, power installations and other symbols of apartheid. Mandela argued that these operations were intended to damage property while avoiding loss of life. The government, however, viewed MK as a revolutionary organization attempting to overthrow the state. In July 1963, police raided Lily's Leaf Farm at Rivonia, near Johannesburg. The farm had been used secretly by activists to meet and plan resistance. Documents recovered there provided the prosecution with evidence concerning sabotage, underground organization and a proposed plan for guerrilla warfare. Mandela had already been imprisoned, but evidence linked him to the movement's leadership. He was brought from prison and made accused number 1 in what became known as the Rivonia trial. The defendants were accused of recruiting people for military training, organizing sabotage, encouraging foreign assistance and conspiring to overthrow the apartheid state through violent revolution. The indictment referred to numerous acts of sabotage and carried the possibility of the death penalty. 10 men eventually faced the main proceedings: Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Raymond Mhlaba, Ahmed Kathrada, Dennis Goldberg, Elias Motsoaledi, Andrew Malongeni, Lionel Bernstein, and James Cantor. Cantor was discharged during the trial because the case against him was insufficient. Bernstein was ultimately acquitted. Mandela and the remaining 7 were convicted. The trial took place in the Palace of Justice in Pretoria under intense security and international attention. The accused were represented by a distinguished defense team led by Bram Fisher, with advocates including Vernon Berrange, George Bezos, and Arthur Chaskalson. In ordinary procedural terms, the defendants had lawyers, could challenge evidence and could cross-examine prosecution witnesses. The defense successfully attacked the original indictment, forcing the prosecution to replace it. One defendant was discharged, and another acquitted. Nevertheless, the wider setting was profoundly unequal.
The men were being prosecuted by a government that denied most South Africans the vote and treated political opposition to racial rule as a threat to state security. Several defendants had been detained for long periods under security laws that permitted isolation and interrogation. The court was applying laws created by the very apartheid system the defendants were attempting to destroy. Mandela did not call himself as an ordinary witness, because doing so would have subjected him to unrestricted cross-examination. Instead, on the 20th of April 1964, he delivered a statement from the dock explaining the history of racial oppression, the failure of peaceful protest and his reasons for turning to sabotage. He concluded by describing a democratic and free society in which all people would live together with equal opportunities. It was, he said, an ideal for which he was prepared to die. Those words were not theatrical exaggeration. The defendants and their lawyers genuinely feared that the judge might sentence them to death. On the 11th of June 1964, Judge Quartus de Wet convicted Mandela, Sisulu, Mbeki, Vlaber, Kathrada, Goldberg, Motsoaledi and Mlangeni of sabotage. The following day, each of the 8 received life imprisonment. Contrary to occasional accounts, none received a shorter fixed term in the Rivonia case. All 8 were sentenced to life. Bernstein had been acquitted, while Cantor had already been discharged. The convicted men could have sought permission to appeal through the South African courts. However, no appeal was pursued. Their legal team had already achieved its most urgent objective, keeping him alive. There was also little confidence that courts operating within the apartheid system would overturn the central findings of the case. 7 of the convicted men were sent to Robben Island. Dennis Goldberg, who was classified as white, was imprisoned separately in Pretoria Central Prison. Even in punishment, apartheid demanded racial separation. Robben Island was selected partly because of its geography. The surrounding sea provided a natural barrier against escape, while the distance from the mainland made communication, visits and public scrutiny extremely difficult. It allowed the government to isolate leading activists from their organizations and from the communities that supported them. Officials hoped that political prisoners sent there would disappear from public life. They would be physically separated, psychologically weakened and gradually forgotten. The prison regime was deliberately harsh. Mandela and other senior political prisoners were held in the isolated single-cell section known as B section. They were separated from much of the general prison population and, during the early years, denied recognition as political prisoners. The authorities treated them as ordinary convicted criminals, although their offenses arose from opposition to apartheid. Mandela was confined in cell number 5. The cell measured only about 2.4 meters by 2.1 meters, little more than 2 steps in either direction. There was no proper bed during his early imprisonment. At night he slept on a thin mat on the concrete floor with a few blankets. A bucket served as a toilet. Mandela remained in that cell from 1964 until his transfer from Robben Island in March 1982, approximately 18 years, rather than 17. Altogether, he spent more than 27 years in prisons, including Pretoria Local Prison, Robben Island, Pollsmoor Prison and Victor Verster Prison. Days on the island were regulated by bells, inspections, forced labor and silence. For many years, prisoners worked in a limestone quarry. The glaring white stone reflected the sunlight so intensely that it damaged the eyes of several prisoners. Letters and visits were severely restricted. Mandela could initially receive and send only a very small number of letters, and correspondence was heavily censored. News from outside was limited. Newspapers were generally forbidden, and information had to be passed secretly between prisoners or gathered from new arrivals. Even food and clothing were divided according to apartheid's racial classifications. Black African prisoners received poorer rations than prisoners officially classified as Indian or colored. African prisoners were initially forced to wear shorts regardless of their age, while Indian and colored prisoners were permitted long trousers. The distinction was intended to reinforce the apartheid claim that different racial groups possessed different status and deserved different treatment. Mandela objected not only to his own treatment but to the system of racial classification inside the prison. Gradually, they forced concessions. Long trousers were eventually provided. Food improved. Educational opportunities expanded. Political prisoners studied law, history, economics and languages. Those with greater education taught those who had been denied schooling. Robben Island became known informally as the University of Robben Island. Prison extracted a terrible personal price. Mandela was separated from his wife, Winnie, and from his children. His mother died in 1968, and his eldest son, Thembekile, died in a motor accident the following year. Mandela was refused permission to attend either funeral. By the 1980s, South Africa was becoming increasingly difficult to govern. Internal resistance intensified. International sanctions and cultural boycotts isolated the country. Foreign investment declined, while images of police repression damaged the government's legitimacy across the world. Mandela was offered conditional freedom more than once. In 1985, President P.W. Botha offered to release him if he renounced political violence. Mandela refused to purchase his own freedom while his organization remained banned and his people remained politically unfree. Secret discussions nevertheless began between Mandela and government representatives. When F.W. de Klerk became president in 1989, the political situation changed rapidly. On the 2nd of February 1990, de Klerk announced the unbanning of the ANC and other prohibited organizations and began releasing political prisoners. On the 11th of February 1990, Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison, holding Winnie Mandela's hand, after more than 27 years of imprisonment. He was 71 years old. Mandela led the ANC delegation, while de Klerk represented the government. Together with negotiators from across South Africa, they helped reach an agreement for a new democratic system. Apartheid laws were progressively repealed, but the decisive political ending came with South Africa's first fully democratic national election, held from 26 to the 29th of April 1994. For the first time, adult South Africans of every race voted together. The ANC won the election, and on the 10th of May 1994 Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as South Africa's first black president. As president, Mandela chose reconciliation rather than collective revenge. His government established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, to investigate gross human rights violations committed during the apartheid conflict. But the question of accountability remains complicated. There was no broad criminal trial of the apartheid system comparable to the Nuremberg trials after Nazi Germany. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission allowed individuals to apply for amnesty if they made full disclosure of politically motivated crimes. Some applications were accepted, others were refused. The process publicly exposed torture, killings, disappearances and abuses by state forces as well as violations committed by members of liberation movements. A limited number of perpetrators faced prosecution, but many victims and families believed that too few offenders were punished. Some officials died without admitting responsibility. Others claimed they had merely followed the laws and orders of the period. Therefore, no single person was held legally accountable for the entire injustice of Mandela's imprisonment or for apartheid as a system. Robben Island eventually ceased operating as a prison and became a museum and national memorial. The authorities who sent Mandela there had hoped that its walls would make him irrelevant. Instead, his cell became one of the most recognized symbols of political imprisonment in modern history. The island did not create Mandela's commitment to freedom, but it tested that commitment for 18 years. It deprived him of his home, his family, his profession, and nearly 3 decades of ordinary life. Yet when the doors finally opened, he emerged not promising racial retaliation, but demanding equal citizenship, constitutional government, and human dignity. That may be the most remarkable part of the story. Nelson Mandela entered Robben Island as a convicted enemy of the apartheid state. He left it as the central figure in the negotiations that would end that state. The prison succeeded in controlling his body. It failed completely to imprison the idea for which he had been prepared to die. Few men in history became legends in their lifetime like Nelson Mandela did.